Welcome back to the MarkLogic Security series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at redaction. To follow along at home, make sure you download and install MarkLogic 9. You can access the code examples that we're going to follow in the hands-on exercise through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. Check out the security project and look at episode 9. In this tutorial, you will describe what redaction is, create redaction rules, describe security considerations when implementing redaction, use the redaction user role, create dictionaries and use redaction functions, and perform redaction on read and export. So what exactly is redaction? Redaction is the process of eliminating or obscuring portions of a document. For example, you can use redaction to eliminate or mask sensitive personal information such as credit card numbers, identification numbers, or email addresses from your documents. The primary use case for redaction is when exporting data. Let's say you need some realistic production data to work with in a development or test environment. It might be unacceptable to provide developers access to real-world personal data from your production system. With redaction, you can automatically redact sensitive data on export and therefore sanitize it for your needs. Redaction can also be applied within an application when a user reads a document. This use case has some security considerations. For proper privacy controls, redaction when reading a document in an application should be used in conjunction with element-level security. We'll see this firsthand in our examples, and then we'll address this properly in our tutorial on element-level security. In this tutorial, we'll take a look at both redaction use cases. Think about the world we live in. We deal with documents every day. For example, this memo that we see here. And in MarkLogic, data can be stored in documents such as XML, JSON, or binaries. So our memo that we see on the left might be modeled in MarkLogic like the JSON document we see on the right. But it might not always be appropriate for a particular person to be able to see the actual values in the document. In our example, based on the James Bond spy series, what if we wanted Bond to be able to know that there was a source, but not to be able to see the actual name and location of that source? In MarkLogic 9, we can define rules to ensure this information is redacted when Bond exports or accesses this document in the system. So let's implement redaction. Now, for those of you who have been watching some of the on-demand tutorials on security, you're already familiar with the model we've been building out based on the James Bond spy series. But for those of you who haven't seen those tutorials, no worries. We've got a script that you can run to quickly get these users and roles added to your environment. Just to recap, for everyone's benefit, the security model for these examples is implemented using 4 roles. We have a role called Project Default, and this role defines what rights someone should have when they visit our application prior to logging in as a known user. We have a Project Admin role. Users with this role will be granted some power within our application that other users are not given. For example, the ability to create new content and update existing content in the database. Then we've got our read roles. We have a role called Top Secret Read. Users with this role will get read permissions on documents classified as top secret. Users with this role will automatically inherit the secret read role. And last, we have the secret read role. Users with this role will get read permissions on secret documents, but not top secret documents. And remember, we also have 3 users who were created in this example. We've got a generic default user, we've got our favorite spy, James Bond, and we've got M, the director of MI6. Now let's implement some redaction rules. Now remember, to follow along with these examples, you're going to want to have first downloaded and installed MarkLogic 9 from our developer community website, and then also clone the GitHub repository from the MarkLogic University GitHub site, which will give you access to all of these code examples in the exercises. So let's get started by importing a workspace found from the MarkLogic University GitHub site. Now when I cloned the MarkLogic University GitHub site data, I created a folder right off the root of my C drive called MarkLogic 9, and inside of there is our security set of tutorials, and inside of there is Redaction, and that's where I'm going to find this workspace. So let's go ahead and import Redaction Dot Xml. Let's start by setting up the roles and users. In this code, we use JavaScript to build an HTTP request to the Management REST API service that will create the roles for our model. So let's go ahead and run this script, and this will create those 4 roles that we discussed. In here we see that that has in fact been done, and of course we could go out to the admin interface and look under our roles to see that they have actually been created. And if we did a quick search, we should see our, for example, top secret read role. Next, let's set up some users. Let's click this next tab titled Setup Users. In this example, we're also going to run some JavaScript code to build a request out to the Management REST API service that will let us create users. And this will create the bond, M, and project default user that we discussed. So let's go ahead and run this to create those users. Next, let's click on the tab titled Load Memo Doc. In here we're going to insert a JSON document that represents the memo from M to bond that we saw in our example. And if we scroll down here, we can see the contents of that defined. Note that for these examples, we're going to keep things simple, and we're going to use the out-of-the-box database called Documents. You'll also note that when we're loading this document, we're assigning permissions to the document. And we're giving the project admin and secret read roles a read permission on the document. Remember, Bond has been assigned the secret read role, so he'll be able to read this document. Let's go ahead and run this to insert this document into the documents database. Now let's implement our first redaction rule. Let's take a look at this tab titled Create Name Redaction Rule. Redaction rules are modeled in a specific JSON or XML structure. They are inserted like any other document into the schema database associated with the content database for your project. Since we are using the out-of-the-box database called Documents as our content database, we'll be using the out-of-the-box schema database that is associated with it called Schemas. And if we look at what we're doing here in this code, you'll note that we're creating a JSON object to define the rule. We're providing a general description for the rule. We're defining a path to the XML element or JSON property for which the rule will be applied. Note that namespaces don't exist in JSON, so we'll go ahead and leave that empty for our example. And finally, we're defining a method and function. Now MarkLogic provides many built-in redaction functions for you to use right out of the box. In this example, we're going to use mask random, which will replace the values with random text, and we're setting it to a fixed length of 10. As we progress throughout this tutorial, we're going to use several different functions in our examples, and you can learn more about the available redaction functions, including the ability to create your own custom functions, by visiting this section of the documentation. Now let's take a look at how we insert the redaction rule. Note that we just use a standard insert function to put the document into the schemas database. But one thing to consider is how you will manage permissions on your rule documents. It's generally advised to have a division between rule administrators, or those who can create, edit, and delete rules, and rule users, or those who can apply rules in order to perform the redaction. In order for a user to apply a redaction rule, they should be given the Redaction User security role. You'll note that when we insert our document here, we are giving read permissions to the secret read role and both read and update permissions to the project admin role. So let's choose our schemas database and run this script to create our redaction rule. Next, let's take a look at the tab titled Redact Document Admin. This code uses the Redaction API's Redact function to read a document and apply the redaction rules in the collection called Memo Redaction Rules. And if you recall, when we did our redaction rule insert in the prior tab, we placed our resulting document into the collection called Memo Redaction Rules. So let's run the code. And here you can see the redacted data in the document that gets returned. But remember, we are logged into Query Console as an admin, so this isn't a very realistic test. In order to do a test that's more realistic, let's take a look at the tab titled Redact Document Bond. Here we're using XDMP eval to run the redaction function as the bond user. Now let's run this code. And you'll notice that what we get here is a security-related error. We need a specific privilege in order to run a redaction rule. And because Bond doesn't have the necessary role that gives him this privilege, he's unable to do this. We can solve this issue by giving Bond the redaction user role, which is a role created specifically for this purpose and is available out of the box in MarkLogic 9 for you to use. In order to give Bond that role, let's take a look at the tab titled Update Roles. In here, we're going to use the Management REST API to give our Bond user the redaction user role. So let's go ahead and run this code to give Bond that necessary role, and then let's go back to our tab titled Redact Document as Bond, and let's try to run this again. And now we see that we are able to run the redaction function as the Bond user and that the redaction has been implemented. Next, let's take a look at the tab titled Redact Document Search. One thing to consider with redaction on read is that you're really just masking data as it's presented. Think of it like a transform on a specific element or property. This could be problematic if a user has the ability to search across the entire document in your application. So let's say Bond is looking to find information on his nemesis, Raul Silva. So he goes to the app and he executes a search for documents that contain the word Silva. This document is returned in the search results because Bond has read permissions on the document and it contains the desired term. Now when we run the search and the document is returned, we can see that our redaction rule has been applied when Bond views the document. But Bond's a smart guy and he knows that he searched for the word Silva, and because it isn't present elsewhere in the document, he could figure out that that word occurs in the redacted data. The lesson here is that redaction on read may be useful, but it is not a substitute for proper security permissions. And in MarkLogic 9, you would be better off managing security of your data inside the database by implementing element level security, which we'll be covering in our next tutorial. But redaction does have a primary use case. It makes it really easy to sanitize production data for use in development or test environments. Let's take a look at this use case in action. Let's take a look at the tab titled Load Agent Doc. For this next example, we're going to create a new type of entity in our database. Instead of memos, we're now going to work with agents. An agent doc describes a particular person in the intelligence domain. Now let's run this code to insert this document into the database. Now let's imagine that a developer needs to test a new application feature and needs some realistic agent data from production in order to do so. It wouldn't be a very good idea to provide real production data that includes the actual name and contact details of the agents, as we wouldn't want that information to leak and fall into the wrong hands. So we'll use redaction to scrub and mask that data when we perform an export or copy operation of the data using MarkLogic Content Pump. Let's take a look at the tab titled Create Dictionaries. One of the pieces of information that we want to scrub in this example is the first and last name of an agent. To do this, we are going to create a dictionary for first name values and a dictionary for last name values. A dictionary stores information in the schema database in a specific XML or JSON structure, and it can then be used by the redaction functions to randomize data. you'll see our dictionaries defined here in the code as JSON objects. Also note the URI that these dictionary documents are being assigned when they are inserted into the database down here. We'll need to reference that URI when we define our redaction rules. So let's run this code and insert our dictionary docs into the schemas database. Next, let's take a look at the tab titled Create Agent Redaction Rules. Here, we're going to create our redaction rules and insert them into the schemas database. We're going to create 4 rules defined in a JSON object that we see below. We're going to create a rule to redact the agent/fname property by randomly selecting a first name from our first name dictionary. We're also going to create a rule to redact the agent/lname property by randomly selecting a last name from our last name dictionary. Third, we're going to create a rule to redact the agent/email property by using the out-of-the-box built-in redact email function. And finally, we're going to create a rule to redact the agent/SSN property by using the built-in redact USSSN function. Let's run this code to put these rules into our schemas database. Now that we've built our rules, let's do a quick test to see how this would work inside of Query Console. Let's go ahead and take a look at the tab titled Test Redaction. And here what we're going to do is a simple query that's going to return our agent document and apply our redaction rules. And if we run this and look at the result, we should see that the first name and the last name are randomized, the email is masked, and the social security number is masked. So our rules are functioning when we read this document. Now let's perform our export. And you'll notice we have one final tab here called Redact on Export, and that just contains a comment because really to do the export we're going to use a tool that is designed for that job, and that tool is MarkLogic Content Pump. So when we export or copy data from our database, we want to apply these redaction rules so the result is a nice sanitized data set for development and test. So let's configure MLCP to export this data and apply these rules during export. Let's start by taking a look at the sample batch file that we provided to you in the redaction content on the GitHub site. So if we open this batch file in a text editor, we'll see that it makes a reference to an MLCP options file and it calls MLCP. Now I'm running on a Windows environment and I have placed the MLCP files right off of the root of C in a folder called MLCP. If you have placed those somewhere else, please edit this batch file and make an appropriate reference. Next, let's take a look at the actual options that are being used here. If we open up this options file here in a text editor, you'll note a few things. That we're using the out-of-the-box application server on port 8000. That application server is set to talk with the documents database. You'll also note that we're specifying an output file path for where we want to export that data to. And here we're just going to put it in a folder right off the C drive called redacted data to keep things simple. And then finally you'll note that we use a parameter here called redaction, and we specify the names of the collections that contain those redaction rules that we want to have applied. And for our example, we're going to apply both the agent redaction rules that we created and the memo redaction rules that we created. Let's take a look at what happens when we run this. So to run this example, I'm going to simply double click on my batch file, and that will invoke MarkLogic Content Pump to perform the export. Next, let's validate the export by taking a look at that folder that the exported data was placed into called redacted data. And you'll notice we have our secret document here, and if we take a look at the contents of that in a text editor, we'll see that yes, the name has been redacted on export as designed. And then let's take a look at our top secret document. And here we can see that the first and last names have been randomized based on our dictionary, and the email and the social security number have been redacted exactly as we designed. In this tutorial, we introduced the key concepts around redaction and provided you with some hands-on examples of redaction in action. To learn more about redaction, check out the Application Developer's Guide in the documentation. In this episode, we focused on describing what redaction is, creating redaction rules, describing security considerations when implementing redaction, using the redaction user role, creating dictionaries and using redaction functions, and performing redaction on read and export. Remember, to follow along with these examples on your own machine, you can download and install MarkLogic 9 from our developer community website, and you can access all the code examples for these tutorials through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And finally, don't forget that if you need more help and assistance, there are plenty of other training options, and you can learn more about those various options by going to marklogic.com/training.